So, my friends, welcome to session 8. Here we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 13 and 14. You can tell that we're coming near the end of the book because there's 16 chapters, so obviously we're coming to the end. We're coming into the Passion story. We're into Holy Week, and the conversations that you're seeing now all have to do with the Holy Week journey. And so what we start out with Mark chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, it says, "As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said, 'Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Do you see all these great buildings?' Jesus says. 'Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down.'" And it's striking is what they're doing is they're coming out the temple and they're going down into the Kidron Valley. They're walking down into it. Like they did on Palm Sunday, they started at the Mount of Olives, walked down to the Kidron Valley, went up into the temple. Now it's late Tuesday, they're coming out of the temple, they're walking down into the Kidron Valley, and then up the side of the mountain. On the other side of the mountain, on the other side of the Mount of Olives, is the little village of Bethany, where Jesus, we believe, was staying overnight. And so they're basically on the Palm Sunday road, only a couple of days later. The Mount of Olives, again, is the highest peak. And so for Jesus to sit on the side of the mountain with his disciples is to look at a panorama of the whole city. You can see on the image that Debbie's put on screen what that panorama looks like today. You're going to notice on that image that she's showing us is the platform, and then you see the Dome of the Rock. The most striking thing you're going to see is the Dome of the Rock. And that is the third holiest site in Islam today. But the plaza that the Dome of the Rock is built on, this huge plaza, was built by Herod the Great in about 20 BC. So you're looking at a building project that had a really good test of time. And what Herod the Great did is he took the top of a mountain. He didn't level the mountain. What he did is he extended the platform out, and he built buttresses below that platform that held the floor up and held it up level. I'm just telling you, you who are engineers, this was an extraordinary feat, and to look at it even today is incredible. In fact, a couple of months ago, I actually stood on this very platform looking at the Dome of the Rock, and I'm walking on the floor that Herod the Great had built in 20 BC. Today, you can actually do something called the rabbinical tunnels, and the rabbinical tunnels walk next to the old temple wall. The platform, you can take tunnels down into the ground to actually see the bedrock and the first stones. And what the disciples talk about with massive stones is truly a reality. The original stones at the bedrock, and you're going to see a picture on screen here, that largest stone, listen to this, the largest stone at the bedrock was 44 feet long, 6 feet high, and 6 feet deep. Let me say that again so you can get the number in your head. It was 44 feet long, 6 feet high, and 6 feet deep. That's one big hunkin' stone. And in fact, we speculate, how did they actually move the stone to that spot? We know where the quarries were that carved out the stones, and then how did they actually get that stone to the wall? We speculated how they did it. There were these engineers that Herod had. These were really, really smart men. And I would encourage you to go to the additional comments in the book for session 8 and to read more about the building construction. It's at comment A. It's no surprise that the disciples would speak with admiration at looking at these buildings. As much as they hated Herod the Great, and the Jews really hated Herod the Great, they gave him grudging respect for his building projects. He knew in order to keep the Jews happy, building one beautiful building would indebt the Jews to him, and it did. So no surprise that they would walk out of the temple, and the disciples would say to Jesus, "Look at these massive stones. After all, they are 44 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 6 feet high. That's a massive stone." And then Jesus says prophetically, "Guess what, guys? There won't be one of them left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." That would be a shocking prophecy. And what we see in the rest of chapter 13 is a prophetic utterance of the end times for the Jews. That's going to happen in their history, and then projecting out to the end times when Jesus would actually return back the second time. So first of all, let's get some dates down. The temple project by Herod the Great started in 19 BC. It was done, get this, it was done in 67 AD. So it started in 19 BC. It wasn't done until 67 AD. And worse, this is the worst thing about it all. It was destroyed in 70 AD. The temple in a completed form only lasted 3 years. So when Jesus died in 30 AD, when he starts his ministry, and we think he died around 33 AD, when he would go to the temple, that temple was incomplete. They were working on it. And a big chunk of it was finished, but they were working on it, and it wasn't fully complete until 37 years after Jesus started his ministry, and then in 70 AD, it's destroyed. It was a massive building. Folks, I'm just telling you, this was a huge, huge building. In fact, we believe the temple itself, the temple building, went up about 100 feet in the air, and it was covered with gold plate. And it was whitewashed. So you saw gold plate on the edges of it, on the framing of the building. And then Herod had it whitewashed, the temple itself. So when the sun would hit that temple, it would just explode across the countryside. I'm just telling you, Herod knew how to build a building. And so, verse 4, tell us when we will see these things, say Peter, James, John, and Andrew. What will be the sign that they're all going to be fulfilled? And so now we see Jesus going into an explanation of the end times. Now, we know there are volumes and volumes written about end times theology. Just so you know, in a Lutheran world, in our tradition, we have stayed away from a lot of pontification about the end times. We just don't deal with it much. The reality is that we don't live looking at the end. We Lutherans tend to look for the Holy Spirit moving in our lives today. So we're not saying, look what the story is out there. We're saying, how can we wrestle with our faith walk today? We have every assurance that Jesus is returning. We never question that. Jesus said he's coming back. So we don't deny an end times. We just don't focus on it. Matthew 28 verse 20 says, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Jesus is with us now, but he also says there's going to be the end of an age. So there will be an end. There is an end, but he's with us until we come to the end. G.K. Chesterton, who was a well-known theologian and an author at the end of the 1800s, said it this way: it is only the fool who tries to get the heavens inside his head, and not unnaturally his head bursts. The wise man is content to get his head inside the heavens. Meaning, we can't define God. God gives us definition. So when we talk about the end times, folks, let God be God, and let's not read a whole bunch of books about the end times and conjecture what it's going to actually look like. In essence, let God be God and trust him. That's what Mark is telling us in chapter 13. Now in verses 9 to 11, Jesus makes it clear that all believers will be persecuted. All believers. So in fact, the Apostle Paul writes, I believe it's 2 Timothy, he says, indeed, all who live a godly life will be persecuted. All who live a godly life will be persecuted. Well, that's encouraging. That is really kind of convicting, isn't it? Jesus says this, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them, and the gospel must be preached to all nations. So you have all of this happening. You're going to be persecuted, but folks, embrace the persecution, because ultimately all the nations need to hear who I am. And the persecution is going to put you in front of people where you can testify of Jesus, and this is the only way it can be done, because persecution will be a gateway to other conversations. And then Jesus is very clear. Don't worry about what to say. when you're in those situations and you're standing before a council or a king or a governor, be assured the Holy Spirit will give you the words to speak. In Mark 13, 14 to 26, Jesus says this. In Mark 14, he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation. This is a prophecy from Daniel chapter 9, 25 to 27. So what we see when Jesus is reading this is he's endorsing that prophecy. He's not hiding from the prophecy. He's acknowledging that what Daniel preached hundreds of years earlier is going to become true. And what that means, the abomination of desolation, is a total disrespect to the temple and the Holy of Holies. It means it's going to be destroyed. And in 70 AD, that was destroyed and the temple was completely abused. The temple was wiped away, never to be built again. And then after all of this, he says, watch. Please watch. Be aware. In verses 15 to 23, if you took a look at that, you would find out that the prayers, it says, these are the flags of the end and the warnings of how bad it actually will be. He's clear that believers do have influence in the end. What we speak does affect people. In fact, Jesus says this in verse 20, but for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. So this period of persecution will be shortened, but it's going to happen, and it's going to be shortened because of the elect. So the believers, the prayers of a believer do make a difference. When we pray, we are speaking to God's heart. We, you and I, do become a testimony of God's faithfulness. We do. We become the testimony of God's faithfulness. And you can see in the verse that the angels will gather the elect from the ends of the earth. That is truly a divine moment. And then finally, chapter 13, if you're looking at verse 32, it says, no one knows about the day or hour, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Mark notes that, that we should be alert because the Father knows, the Son doesn't. Some years ago, I saw a speaker come to a local church to talk about the end times. There were advertisements sent out and flyers were put in car windows and so on and so on. And I just remember reading it, and the text says, it was an end-time speaker at a non-Lutheran church, that something said to the effect, we don't know the day or the hour, but we can certainly guess the year. So this speaker was going to get up and talk about a year, projecting what year Christ would return. I found that really interesting. And as Jesus would say, be careful of those guys. Be careful, be suspect of those guys. What Jesus does call us to is to live our life faithfully and to watch. Be aware, be faithful, yet live. Don't focus on the end, but focus on growing your relationship with Jesus now. We don't avoid the end, we simply don't fixate on it all that much. But rather, we look to our calling now and share Jesus to our neighbor. And so this really extensive chapter on end times that covers a multitude of information that's simply too much for me to cover in a Bible study is filled with end times issues that are going to happen when Jerusalem's destroyed in 70 AD, but also images and pictures of what it will be when we come to the end of all time. And Jesus, that section ends at verse 37. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. Watch. Now we go back to the narrative in chapter 14. Now we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at what he says, how the story is starting to move forward. What Mark notes to us in chapter 14, 1 and 2. He says, now the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him, but not during the feast, they said, or the people may riot. Now the feast he's talking about, you have the Passover feast that started on Thursday, and then following the feast of the Passover, that was the first day for the festival of unleavened bread, which ran for about 7 days. And so they were very concerned that they wouldn't do anything that would erupt the crowds and that they would be prone to violence and rioting. So the Sanhedrin wants all of its business done with Jesus as quickly as they could. And they were looking for some kind of corruption because they couldn't figure out how to get to him. Jesus was leaving the city. There were hundreds of people. They would just lose Jesus in the crowd, so they had no access to Jesus, and they were becoming they wanted to get him before the actual Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread actually started. And that's what we see in verses 3 to 10. Now, what you can do is take a moment, and I want you to read Mark 4 and read the 7 verses. Read 3 to 10 and this preparation for the Passover. So when you read 3 to 10, you're going to see these are all preparation of the Passover, despite the fact that the meal isn't being prepared. What we have in the preparation is when Passover comes, the arrest comes, the death comes, and then the resurrection. And now we have this remarkable story that's happening. It's going to happen in the town of Bethany. Remember, on one side of the Mount of Olives is Bethany, then you would climb up over the top of the Mount of Olives and you would see the panorama of the whole city of Jerusalem. So Jesus is at home during this week, and on this particular day, this would be Thursday, he is now in Bethany, and it looks like he's at a lunch. He's reclining at the table in the home of a man named Simon the leper. Oh, there was a guy who was Simon who was a leper, but it looks to me that Simon the leper was probably healed, so he's probably Simon the leperless. But at this point, he's Simon the leper. That stayed with him. And we're told that as Jesus ate at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very, very expensive perfume. And it says it was made out of pure nard. Now, the nard comes from India, and it was a very, very expensive imported perfume. And we know from the other Gospels, it was worth about a year's wage. This was one pricey perfume. And this was this lady's expression of love for Jesus. And so she comes into the house with this very expensive nard, and she broke the jar and she poured the perfume on his head so it would go down his face, down his beard, down his hair. And the aroma, you can imagine the aroma would just fill the room. And we know from John chapter 12 that it's Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who actually is doing this. And at least it would seem. And as she poured the perfume and the aroma fills the air in this extraordinary gesture of generosity. Folks, this is called restless love. Let me say it again. This is called reckless love. Reckless love. Love that's just overwhelming, pouring freely. And it's just a love of abandon. Maybe it's kind of you see your little child coming and you just scream in delight when the little kid jumps into your arms. And the little kid has got reckless abandon of love because they see their parent or their grandparent and they're just so excited to see them and they're just shaken with excitement. That's what's going on here. This is reckless love. This woman enters into the home. She pours the perfume on his hair. And it goes down. You can see it dripping down his head and maybe down into his beard. And then those that were present began to complain that this perfume was so expensive, we could have given this money to the poor. Jesus rebuked that person. But what is so striking, look at verse 5, I should say. It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, said one of those present that was rebuking the woman, and the money given to the poor, and they rebuked her. Notice the word harshly. And then Jesus speaks up. Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. I tell you the truth. Wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. This act of reckless generosity will never, ever be forgotten. And guess, look at verse 10. Guess who complained? Judas Iscariot. We know that from John chapter 12, and now in verse 10 it says Judas leaves and he goes to the chief priests and he works out a deal to betray Jesus, and now they've got the inside, someone who's corrupt in the inside that will lead them to Jesus. Verse 9 tells us, whenever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. I'm going to tell you, talk about legacy. Think of the stories that get shared from generation to generation. Are they the legacy stories? Stories that empower faith? Likely not. But it says here that whatever she did that day will never ever be forgotten. It will all be done and they will know who she is. In verse 10, Judas works out a deal to betray Jesus and they were delighted. And you can see now a contrast between the woman's reckless love and generosity, and you see Judas's self-promotion. All of it for Judas is just bad. For the woman, it's overwhelmingly good. So you see these extremes taking place in a matter of a little bit of a period of time. Now, if you pause the video, and I want you to read verses 12 to 26 in chapter 14, and then as a group, answer the questions below it. And when you've read the text and answered the questions, please come back. This is Thursday. Again, this is Thursday during the day. Jesus has everything organized. He obviously knew people, and he set things up so they could have their Passover together. So he did the administrative details of working out the potluck lunch. Most houses only had a small room, but this particular family had an upper room, and we think it was likely Mark's home. It meant that the family had some means, some resources, because to have a large room would be a sign of that. The meal happened within the city limits, inside the wall, which put Jesus at risk, put him most at risk. He was safer outside the wall, but inside the city wall, he's now at higher risk. And we know from John that Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. He didn't baptize them, he scrubbed them. And that he talked about loving one another. And yes, he did talk about a betrayer among them. So the meal starts and he gets on his knees as the chief of servants and he washes their feet. And we know that that Peter resisted that, and Jesus said that he had to do it. Peter, I have to do it. And so we see now this whole journey of walking into the Lord's Supper and the whole meal. This is all of the meal stuff that's happening over the Passover time on that Thursday night. And then we see in verse 27, if you drop down, it says, you will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it's written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead to you in Galilee. So he's going, they don't quite understand what he's talking about. You're going to betray me, and then when I rise, you're going to meet me in Galilee. They don't quite get what any of that means. Peter declares, even if all fall away, I will not. I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. That's what Jesus says. It's going to be written. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. You're all going to run. Even if I fall away, I will not leave you. And Jesus answered, I tell you the truth. By the way, I tell you the truth, that's a command statement. I'm telling you, Peter, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter, it says, insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others agreed. Well, we know how well that went. And so after the dinner is done, they leave the upper room And they go to a place where Jesus frequented for prayer. It was the Garden of Gethsemane. Only the wealthy had gardens because, they're kind of big. And so here was this Garden of Gethsemane outside the city wall, and we're not quite sure who owned it. Maybe it was Nicodemus. There was a strange Jewish law that said the city's sacred soil might not be polluted with manure for the gardens. Well, that's interesting. So the gardens were outside of the city walls because they could never fertilize the gardens. So for the sacredness, they moved the gardens outside the wall. So when Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, he is actually leaving the city, which was just a short walk. It's very dark in the night. Don't think lights like we have. Just think darkness with a little candle. And from the reading, it's apparent that Jesus is looking for, one, human fellowship. He feels alone. Can you not stay awake? He wants human fellowship. And then number two, he's certainly yearning for God's fellowship. And in this moment of deepest emotion, he's seeking the loyalty of his friends and appealing to God. What is certain is that Jesus didn't want to die, and he was submitting to the Father's will. He chooses to confront death for the sake of those he loved. You can read more in the extra comments about this. What I'd like you to do now is I want you to pause the video, and I'd like you to read verses 32 to 41. I would suggest assigning verses to individuals in your small group and go around a circle and read them. So when you read these verses, I gave some instructions on how to read them. I asked you to read them meditatively, pausing, considering quietly what is being done for our sake. Take the time, let the text become more than a simple reading. If you just read through it quickly, I would ask you to go back, pause the video, and do it in a really reflective manner, and hang on each of the words of the story. It is a very, very powerful an amazingly beautiful story, even in all of its pain. Now we're into verses 43 to 50. Now in the dark of the night, with no crowds around, Judas does come, and he does betray Jesus. Servants of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, are sent. Notice there are no Roman guards here. Mark calls them a crowd, a disorganized group, a mass. Not a military order, but a mass of people. So it wasn't in any kind of military configuration, just a mass of people to go and arrest Jesus. And then Judas went up and he actually kissed Jesus. Now, there are a couple of Greek words for kiss. You can fill in the blanks. The first is called philion. And philion means a simple kiss and nothing more. It's kind of like greeting someone and kissing them on the cheek. Maybe we might say, whom I shall kiss, that is he. And you just kiss him, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. Then there's the second kiss, and it's called kataphilion. Kata is intensive, such as a lover's kiss that you might have. What's striking, the word in Greek that's used is kataphilin. The betrayer was a lover's kiss. It wasn't just a token kiss, but it was an affectionate kiss. A betrayer's affectionate kiss. I'm going to say this is the most awful of the gospel story, because you see Judas go up and kiss Jesus, and we could just say he did a peck on the cheek, but I'm going to suggest that what the Greek said is no, this was an affectionate embrace, an affectionate kiss that Judas would have done to Jesus, showing that he knew Jesus well. We do see that there's an arrest. We do know that there was an ear cut off. We know it was Peter who did such a thing with wielding his sword, and he cut the ear off of a soldier. And we know the servant's name from the Gospel of Mark, and the ear was put back on. And Jesus is clear, he wasn't here to fight battles. So now what I want you to do, look at verses 53 to 65. Now what we're seeing is we're moving into the court trials. The goal, of course, is to kill Jesus. So whatever it takes to kill Jesus, they're going to do it. So there are three Jewish trials that take place. They're brief. In one case, they're brief. So first of all, we have a preliminary hearing before Annas, the retired high priest. And you can write that down. Annas is the retired high priest. The problem is that Annas was really the influence behind the high priestly office. So Caiaphas did Annas's bidding. And that's really quite striking, because the first place they take Jesus is to Annas, who then is going to give permission to move him to Caiaphas, which he does. So now you have the trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin then does an all-night trial. Again, the goal is to kill Jesus. That's their intention. The funny thing about this is, understand, Jewish law dictated that a trial could only be done during the day, and it had to be in public, and it couldn't happen during a major festival. So the Jews were breaking all these laws. It was at night, it wasn't public, and they were starting a major festival. Official decisions could only be in the temple area, not in a private home. So they would have to go to the temple in the Gentiles' courtyard, which, again, a very large area, and then they could announce the decision, and not in a private home. And of course, a person could never testify against himself. So when you're looking at the text, all of the things I just noted to you, the Jews broke. Caiaphas broke these so that he could get the outcome that he actually wanted to have. In fact, we know in verses 61 and 62, the high priest interviewed Jesus with leading questions. And this ultimately broke all of the Jewish laws, and ultimately Jesus was condemned. In verse 65, if you look at it, you'll notice it says, "Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him. The Sanhedrin abused Jesus, and he was left in the pit at Caiaphas' house until the morning." And that is most certainly true. You can go to Caiaphas' house today. They have identified it, the real house, and you will see down in the floor of that house, you will see what would be a pit where Jesus would have sat the whole night. What I'd like you to do is to take a pause, and I want you to read Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 65. I want you to read it quietly and reflect on the verses. Take a pause and let the transformation penetrate into our busy minds, and then restart the video when you've completed that reading. And finally, we come to the last part of the chapter, and it's verses 66 to 72. And again, it's a very painful part of the reading. What we have is Jesus arrested. Jesus has been beaten. He's on trial. And look at verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls in the high priest came. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely. "You also were with the Nazarene." So now we go into Peter's actual betrayals and the shame that he would carry for the rest of his life. The fact, we know from the Gospel of John, that John had some access into the high priest's house. John was allowed into the trial where Jesus was. Peter was not allowed in, so he was in the courtyard with the other servants. And he's confronted. And then we see in the confrontation that took place that he denies Jesus 3 times. The shame will be with Peter forever, for the rest of his life. And I know he's forgiven, but I know he didn't forget. Because each of us, I'm afraid, each of us has a story of disloyalty and shame. We all carry it. For Peter, it will set with him it will just sit in his heart, even past the resurrection. And it took a special intervention by God himself to redeem Peter, because Peter was pretty broken by his behavior. And the reality is, I think we would have done the same. The fear of losing your life and being arrested, I think that would have overwhelmed a whole bunch of us. So now we have Jesus speaking into our lives and forgiving us of our betrayals as he forgave Jesus he forgave Peter of his betrayals. So for the next session, I want you to read chapters 15 and 16, and we will be wrapping up the Gospel of Luke. Thank you for listening to the video.